Today, we become legends.
Continuing our series of one buff for every Smite god, today we cover the largest class in Smite, that of course being the mages. As always, I'm not suggesting all mages actually need a buff, nor am I suggesting all of these buffs be implemented exactly as they are, they're just ideas. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you can catch the final episode of this series covering Hunters as soon as it drops, as well as all my other content coming soon for Season 10. You can always unsub if you don't like what you see, but without further ado, let's jump in with our first mage buff.
Agni.
My main buff I would have gone for with Agni has already been implemented, that being the small burst of damage on Noxious Fumes, so my suggestion is that Agni's passive, Combustion, stacks from abilities in addition to basic attacks. This would only be once per ability and would just make sense in my opinion since Agni is such a heavily ability damage reliant god, it never really felt good to have to basic attack 4 times, especially in a team fight just to use his passive.
Upwash.
During Upwash's ultimate, he blends in with the Wraiths and becomes stealth for the duration as long as he remains in the area of effect. The stealth is broken temporarily by taking damage or getting CC'd, similar to Loki's stealth, but will not be broken by Upwash casting abilities or dealing damage himself. This is a bit of a playstyle change and more than a simple buff, but I think the idea of Upwash having some unconventional safety mechanism that's not just a leap would be really cool. This stealth would allow him to ult and cast abilities from stealth and potentially eat corpses as well to heal while he's in the Wraiths, and I think this really adds to his creepy death vibe.
Anubis.
So much to some people's surprise, I'm fine with Anubis' design for the most part, and I want to keep him as a sort of glass cannon mage with everything to lose and everything to gain. His 1 makes the most sense for a change in my opinion, and so I suggest that each tick of Locust applies a stacking damage dealt debuff to targets. Maybe 2 to 3% per stack depending on how strong that would be. I think it makes thematic sense because he's using Locusts that are pretty well known for forming plagues which weaken the population, and also gameplay sense as a way to keep him a little bit safer without just adding straight up mobility or more defenses to his kit.
Ao Kuang.
So this one might be a controversial opinion, but my buff to Ao Kuang is to make his 3 proc basic attack item effects again. This used to be how it worked, and Ao was played with a much more bursty Polynomicon and Soul Reaver build, relying more on that initial hit of the 3+2 Dragon Throw and Polynomicon and Reaver, and then executing the target. Whereas now he relies a bit more on attack speed and getting max dragon value from his 2. I personally think the game is ready for this nerf to be reverted, and I think he had a much more fun playstyle when it wasn't the case, even if it does come with some kind of limitation similar to Charybdis if necessary, such as reduced damage with the on-hit effects.
Aphrodite.
Yep, it's come to this, I have to suggest a buff for Afro. It is a sad day indeed. This buff is for Kiss. Instead of stopping at the first enemy god and stunning, the Kiss would pass through enemies, mesmerizing them all for 2 seconds. Any god awakened from the mez early will deal reduced damage to Aphrodite and her soulmate for a short duration. So I went with Kiss simply because I think it's Afro's least interesting ability. All it really does is choose a soulmate or stun one guy for a bit. A mez makes more thematical sense for Afro than a stun I think, and this allows it to hit multiple gods and even minions if that would be relevant. And if they awaken early, they deal less damage to Aphrodite as they're still in love with her from the kiss. It would still stop on hitting an ally, but this also prevents enemies from body blocking the kiss from hitting your allies, which is another secondary buff. The bonus damage your soulmate deals to enemies hit would still be present with this buff.
Baba Yaga.
So what buff can I really suggest for a god that's only ever been buffed since her release for a total of like 15 buffs over just a few patches? Well, I suggest to replace the slow and attack speed slow on her bruise with a root and disarm respectively if the potion's dominant ingredient type is that type, aka if it has 3 or more of that ingredient in that potion. This might be a bit hard to word in the ability description, but basically if the dominant ingredient is Dragon Scale, it roots instead of slowing, and if Wolf Tooth is the dominant ingredient, it disarms instead of just slowing attack speed. This would add a little bit more randomness to the kit, but not too much I wouldn't say, and would allow Barra players to fish for a specific potion to store in the slot for later, like a root potion to confirm her 1, or a disarm potion if a Mercury is diving her in teamfights for example. You could even add a burn over time if Eye of Newt is the dominant ingredient as well, just for consistency's sake, so all 3 ingredients have a different effect if they're dominant in the potion.
Baron Soundy.
This is a simple one. Upon stunning an enemy with his ultimate, a wave of voodoo magic spreads from the coffin, which sets all gods caught in the magic to the hysteria level of the enemy hit by the coffin. This would allow potentially more liberal use of the ultimate, since even if the enemy tank instantly eats the stun, other enemies in range will get a ton of hysteria applied to them and allow Baron to follow up with his other abilities using those hysteria bonuses.
Tonga.
After travelling 1000 units or more when fetching items, the next time the Jade Rabbit fetches you an item, he will also bring a random potion as a gift. The progress towards your next free potion will be displayed on a passive meter that fills up as the rabbit travels more distance. If you have no spaces to hold the potion when it arrives in your consumable slots, it will just activate instantly, similar to if you're buying potions in the fountain. This will be a random basic potion, so mana, health, or multi, and it won't include chalices or other consumables like power potions, obviously. This adds to Changa's theme of sustainability, and it always felt weird that getting a potion with her passive was sort of a waste because you only get one at a time and it takes so long. This way you can get your items as normal and get random potions occasionally as a gift to help with sustainability.
Chronos.
So this is a simple one, and is to change the maximum health heal on section 1 of Chronos' 2 to be either magical lifesteal or a heal that scales with magical power. Max health heals on gods like Chronos just don't make a whole lot of sense as he's never going to build extra health, so I think a lifesteal buff makes a lot more sense, especially since it's on his steroid so he can utilize the lifesteal at full value using basic attacks rather than at 1/3 value using AoE abilities. But this could work just as well as a standard heal that scales with magical power.
Discardia.
So my idea for Disco is to make her passive utilize the entire T-screen and not just top damage. Top damage taken and mitigated would each get 1 scaling up to 10 protections, physical for damage taken and magical for damage mitigated, and top gold will get 0.3 scaling up to 3 GP5 based on level. The power would probably need to be nerfed down a little bit to make room for these other stats to make the passive not completely broken, but they're fairly minor overall and wouldn't break the passive, I don't think. The only thing that may be an issue is the GP5 on an already ahead player, but 3 GP5 is only 36 extra gold per minute. Even if you had this passive for the entirety of a 20-minute game, it would be 720 gold. Basically a tier 1 item. However, this could be nerfed down to 2 GP5 or even less if it would be broken, because extra gold generation is extremely powerful in Smite and you don't want to be going too crazy with it.
E-set.
So just a small E-set buff here, as I'm sure no one wants to see her dominating the meta again, but I feel a small slow for enemies and movement speed increase for allies in her ult would work nicely. Maybe 20% each way or so to allow her to confirm the ult a little bit more easily on enemies and give her allies more juking potential while waiting for the ult to charge and detonate.
Freya.
Speaking of gods you don't really want to buff, for Freya I think allowing her to refire Banish, which by the way, why is this ability still just called Banish after 3 reworks of this god? Imagine if Apollo's Serenade was just called Mesmerize. Seems a bit silly to me, but yeah, allow her to refire Banish at any time to cancel the CC. This would just give her more flexibility, as once she's in position to follow up on Banish with basic attacks, she could deactivate it and get her damage out faster, instead of having to wait for the enemy to drop down after the full duration. You could also just drop enemies into predictable allied abilities like Vulcanal if they otherwise wouldn't drop down in time.
Hades.
So this is a bit of a crazy buff, but hey, he got a tier 5 skin recently, so I guess he's due for one. I propose that if the Shroud of Darkness hits a blighted enemy, it summons 2 shadowy ghosts from the underworld that chase enemies and can be detonated with Devour Souls in the same way that minions can, at which point they vanish. This would allow Hades to more reliably get big damage from Devourer's Souls in teamfights rather than just in lane around minions. This could be changed to 1 ghost minion if necessary, and I even have ideas of adding other synergies like basic attacking the ghosts explodes them, applying blight in a large area or something like that, but I'll keep it simple here and not try to rework his entire kit and just go with the Devour Souls synergy. Hebo buffs. Time to piss some people off, I guess. As with Agni from earlier, my long time idea for a Hebo buff was the removal of his self root on his 3, which is now implemented, so my secondary idea is to make his ult tremble enemies it hits. Tremble is overall a not too impactful CC, and while I am conscious of giving Hebo more CC, a 1 second Tremble makes thematical sense for a crushing wave hitting them and definitely wouldn't be too broken.
Hell.
So this is a simple one, and is to give her Light Stance 1 some kind of homing functionality when targeting allies. I don't really know how feasible this would be on a technical level in terms of actually implementing it, as it would have to recognize it's an ally before firing and change mode or something, since we don't want it homing onto enemies. But this ability is just really annoying to use when your Adderall brain 12-year-old teammates are zooming around the teamfight at light speed and you're trying to actually hit them with this.
Hera.
So this one is more thematic than super impactful, but it would still be useful for sure, and that's Argus dealing 20% more damage to the enemy god that most recently damaged Hera. Being the defender of Hera, it makes sense for him to be enraged and fight more fiercely against the enemy that is attacking Hera at the current moment.
Janus.
So this is a pretty simple one. Increase the max stacks of Threshold's movement speed buff to 3, nerfing the speed accordingly to be a similar amount total. We definitely don't want to give Janus 60% movement speed from this. But when he reaches 3 stacks, he's cleansed of all slows and roots as a one-time thing that won't be refreshed until he loses and regains 3 stacks of the Threshold buff. This will make him a lot more slippery, but in combination with an overall nerf to the movement speed of this effect, giving it over 3 stacks instead of over 2, I think this could be balanced for him, and I do like the idea. Plus, as I said at the start of this video, I'm not saying all these buffs have to be implemented directly as they are, I'm just spewing ideas out here.
Kukulkan.
So this might seem like a strange buff at first, but hear me out. I would add haste to Kukulkan's 2 for the duration. Not only does this kinda make sense for the ability thematically, but it also allows his follow-up Polynomicon basic attacks after his 1 to come out with haste if he used his 2 beforehand. So he doesn't slow down when going for those additional Polynomicon basic attacks. Haste is a very powerful effect, and giving it to someone for so long is risky, but I don't think Cuckoo is going to become an ADC anytime soon, and this buff would just help him out with weaving in those poly basic attacks after his 1.
Merlin.
So this one is very spicy and might well be too strong, but you could nerf the overall damage of either of these 2 abilities to compensate. I will make it so Ice Stance 1 roots the enemy if they were affected by Ice Stance 2's slow. You could also make it so it roots only at the maximum slow stacks from his 2, but that very rarely happens unless they're already getting CC'd into his 2. I feel like this will give a lot more synergy within Ice Stance, similar to how Void Stance has its 1 into 2 combo. Ice Stance could do a similar thing by dropping Blizzard and then rooting enemies into it with his 1. The root would probably be just like 1 second or something to keep it balanced, but this would guarantee an extra 2 ticks of Blizzard if you manage to root them in the area.
Morgan Le Fay.
So this is a simple one, and it mostly just reverts some of the indirect nerfs that Morgana got from her DR changes. I would make the fear on her 1 immune to being DR'd. This would allow her to use her more practical CC combo of 2 into 1 instead of having to do 1 into 2, which is less practical just to avoid the fear being DR'd down to 0.4 seconds because of her 2. If it was immune to DR, you could do this combo either way and not have the fear be decimated in duration.
Nox.
So another simple one here, and that's making Nox's dash apply a small slow on hit, maybe 20% or so. This would allow Nox to use her dash aggressively to slow enemies, making it easier to confirm her combo, and also would allow her to dash through enemies on her escape and slow them as well to prevent chase. You could go even further with this if you wanted to buff Nox more by making her explosion after leaving an ally also slow, and potentially even if you hit the enemy with both the initial dash and the explosion after leaving an ally, it roots instead of slowing. There's a lot of potential here, and you could do one or all of these effects depending on how strong you wanted Nox to be.
Nua.
So this is more of a quality of life change really, but it would result in a substantial buff, and that's to make Nua's passive only trigger on gods, not minions and jungle monsters. I often find myself wanting to save that root for an engage on an enemy god, but also wanting to basic attack the minion wave for clear. This would allow you to have more control over the roots. It could still be consumed if you miss the basic attack entirely, or you could even change that and make it so you keep it until it hits a god, but that might be a bit too far as you'd have a guaranteed root every team fight.
Oloran.
Another simple one here to help Oloran's boxing a little bit. Enemies hit by his 1 focus light will have their attack speed slowed by a varying amount based on the distance travelled, up to a maximum of maybe 25% at max range and 10% at point blank. This could also go further with the added range of firing his 1 through his ult, but that's a bit more of a niche application.
Persephone.
Buffs to Persephone. Other than Afro and maybe Hades, this is the mage I want to see buffed the least. So a small but thematic buff I had in mind was that her ult drops plants on being destroyed early. This could be just 1 plant or even 2 or 3, it could even be 1 plant every time it's basic attacked. This all depends on how much you want to buff Persephone. For me, probably just 1 extra plant. This would just give her a little bit of extra value if her ult is immediately denied by being destroyed by basic attacks.
Poseidon.
So this one is maybe closer to a minor rework than just a buff idea, but my idea for Poseidon is that his abilities should have some small additional effects if they consume Tide, not just bonus damage. His 2 would remain as is, not consuming Tide and being a good way to build it back up. His 1 though, I would add an extra slow for a couple of seconds after it hits if it consumes Tide. His 3 would have a stronger vortex that is much harder to escape if you're caught in it, somewhere in between POS 3 and Hades ult, still escapable by just walking but much harder to do so. And finally, if Kraken consumes Tide, it will strike out with its tentacles, lashing enemies in the immediate area around the Kraken, dealing damage and slowing them. This will give a larger total area of effect, but these tentacle hits will deal significantly less damage than getting hit by the actual Kraken hit, so as to not encourage just missing the ability.
Ra!
So Ra is a very compact kit that's somewhat hard to buff and nerf besides damage and healing numbers. My idea is that his passive would also provide 3% bonus healing and 5% bonus damage per stack in addition to the movement speed. This isn't a super flashy buff by any means, but as I said, Ra is a hard one to actually make big changes to, and many of the big changes that could be made already have been over the years.
Raijin.
So this is a bit of a spicy one, but hey, Raijin's not been meta for a while, so why not? I would make it so Raijin's ult also deals its damage and effect in a small area around him, in addition to the line going out from him. This would allow him to still hit melee gods diving him while dishing out damage downrange as well. A lot of the time this really won't make a difference, but when it does matter, it could be a huge impact in teamfights.
Scylla.
So this is a really small one, but should help with keeping Scylla a bit safer in the early game and late game teamfights. I suggest that when Scylla TPs to her 3, she slows enemies around her by a small amount, say 20% for 2 seconds. This would be around her when she TPs, not around the Sentinel itself, and this would help her escape melee gods that are diving her by slowing them as she TPs to prevent chase, a bit similar to the Nox buff that I suggested.
Sol.
A potentially controversial one here for Sol, and that's to add back the stun on detonation of her trail of a 3. This was how it worked at release, and while I don't want to see the haste brought back to the ability, I think bringing back the stun would be feasible in modern Smite, where the power level is generally a lot higher than it was back in Season 2 at Sol's release. If this would be too strong, you could always make it root instead of stun.
Morrigan.
So this one is pretty crazy, and I don't really even know if it would be good or not. I propose that if Morrigan doesn't use the ultimate of her selected god before transforming back, her ultimate gets a drastically reduced cooldown, maybe 30 to 40 seconds, potentially 50. This would allow some gods that don't necessarily have a good ultimate to be viable transforms for her to get their base kit only but on a much lower cooldown, allowing Mori more flexibility in her use of Changeling. This might be busted, but you could always change the cooldown of this effect to make it weaker or stronger if needed.
Thoth.
A small but impactful buff for Thoth here, and that's to allow him to throw his 2 while in the channel of his ultimate. Any good Thoth knows to activate his 1 before throwing the 2's projectile so he can instantly follow up with his 1 rather than doing the animation for it and then firing. I suggest that this should work the same way with his ultimate, and that you can pre-charge the ult, throw the 2 while in the channel, and immediately hit confirm the ult if the 2 lands. As it is, there's not even close to enough time to charge the ult after rooting with his 2, unless you're going to fire it instantly for massively reduced damage. This might be too strong and nerfs could be applied if needed, but I kinda like this idea to make Thoth's gameplay a little bit more fluid.
Tiamat.
So Tiamat already has a ton going on in her kit, so I'll go with something small here. When consuming a jungle buff, it becomes the enhanced version of that buff. This would allow a bit more power to be brought to the idea of consuming buffs, which I think is a really cool unique mechanic that Tiamat has.
Vulcan.
The ability to fire Vulcan's 1 while rooted was a great idea for a buff, so I don't want to go too crazy here. My suggestion is that marked enemies by backfire will be rooted by the next shot of his turret that hits them for 1 second. This gives a bit more synergy between his turret and his 1, and a different way to use his kit. Instead of always doing meatball into backfire, you could do backfire, turret shot to get the root, and then confirm meatball off of that instead.
Yu Huang.
Allowing him to basic attack while channeling his 2 would be a cool idea. This will give him a bit more synergy with his basic attacking passive, and makes the insanely long channel time of the full Dow version of this ability to be a bit less painful. He can still poke down the enemy god or minion wave while charging this and clean up with the big hits.
Zeus.
So no one really wants Zeus buffs, least of all me, but this video won't be complete without it. This one is spicy as it gives Zeus some minor sustain within his kit. I suggest that when using Detonate, Zeus heals a flat amount per charge detonated, maybe 50 or so. This could also scale with magical power if needed, but I don't want to overdo it given how volatile Zeus's balance can be. Even small buffs can make Zeus a top meta pick. I feel like some minor sustain on Zeus makes sense for his kit, given he's low mobility and will often take a lot of poke and be dived a lot, so adding this could help him sustain off some of that damage that he takes. And finally, the Fat Man himself. This one takes a little bit of inspiration from old Nuwa while tying into his mini auto attack theme on his 3. While ulting, Zhongkui's basic attacks would deal double damage and hit in a small area around the target. I always liked this idea of Zhong's 3 giving him some minor basic attack synergies and wanted to lean into that a little bit more. Plus, Old Wa was one of my favourite gods back in the day, and her metal crystal activation on her ult did pretty much this effect, along with her fire crystal that give her AoE basic attacks. This is pretty much that. But that's all I got for one impactful buff for every mage in Smite. If you have your own cool ideas, then definitely drop a comment down below, and don't forget to drop a like before you leave. Catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.